Hello and welcome to this video on the weird mind-melding penis thing from Avatar. If you watch Avatar and remember anything from this brief flash in the cultural zeitgeist, it is either that the graphic effects were great, or they have this weird way of communicating with animals, plants, and each other. The weird way is something that looks halfway between a ponytail and a plant tendril. This is a truly odd way for any species to communicate and interact, and it does get very weird as you'll come to understand. Let's start with the canonical description of the weird sex organ. It's called a neural QQ. The Navi name is tswin or kuru. It's an appendage that is part of many species' anatomy on Pandora, including the Navi. It functions as a biological cable that connects the spiritual consciousness to a variety of animals, and all plants on Pandora, and most importantly to their weird parasitic god, Awa. Pandoran wildlife encase theirs in a highly sensitive neural whip. This is a protective layer of skin that houses a set of thin pinkish tendrils that appear somewhat like hair but are actually extensions of the creature's nervous system. Most Pandoran life possesses either one or two of these cues, which raises some interesting questions about what it's used for in other scenarios, but getting off track with that. When a creature connects these tendrils with that of another being, it's an act known to the Navi as Sahelu. It enables mental communication between the two entities. This also means sharing of information, including memories, emotions, and sensory input. In Avatar, particularly Frontiers of Pandora, it's revealed that the Navi can connect their cues and access each other's memories, which does present some pretty serious issues. It's unclear if the avatars can do this with the Navi too, or with each other's avatars. The connection doesn't just happen between two creatures, and that's because many flora of Pandora are capable of initiating the connection as well. Most notably the Tree of Souls, the Tree of Voices, and the Tasu plants, which are supposed to be access points to the Pandora neural network. Awa's a tool of control for Pandora and the Navi in particular. Before the RDA was expelled and eventually returned, they did demonstrate that you could cut this, and it would have rather nasty effects. They found this by experimenting on Pandoran wildlife. Part of the experiment was called the Feral Project, and it was intended to train animals to be vicious killers that could be controlled. Something of an oxymoron, but sure. An example of this is where Thanators and Viper Wolves had surgeries performed on them to cut the Q, and by forcibly removing them, they then became rather erratic in their behaviour. This is supposed to be partly associated with severing their connection to Awa, but it appears to apply to other animals as well. And now with that out of the way, let's open Pandora's box of Pandora. The neural cue is known to the Navi as the tswin or kuru, and it is fiction obviously, but we can look at it as a biological appendage central to the anatomy and physiology of many species on the moon Pandora, and understand not only how it works, but why it works, and certainly some of the problems that how they've shown it and everything said about it generates. First of all, it serves as an external extension of the nervous system. This does enable direct neural interfacing between organisms. This of course does mean we need to become quite speculative, as there's not that many things on Earth that we can compare it to, and it is therefore very squarely rooted in science fiction, but it is inspired by some real-world neurobiology, bioelectricity, and symbiotic ecosystems. We can extrapolate from that on how a structure might function physiologically and anatomically, although we should be very clear that we do speculate quite heavily. At the same time, some of these things are fairly predictable consequences based on what is observable and how it functions. The cube positions and contrasts with the human-Navi hybrid, or the avatars as they are, and the recombinants, the genetically engineered Navi bodies. That's because in the case of the Navi themselves, the cue emerges from their head, effectively, the top of their head. Whereas with the man-made versions and those that have been modified, it instead comes from something closer to the brain stem. This potentially reflects the genetic modifications for compatibility with human neural architecture. Macroscopically, the cue resembles a thick braid or ponytail, typically 1 to 2 meters long in an adult Navi, although lengths do appear to vary by species and individual. Its external appearance is deceptive. For the Navi, what we effectively have is a case made out of what looks like a woven sheath of long hair, which grows from birth. This provides not just camouflage, but thermal regulation and some mechanical protection against environmental hazards, like thorns or predators. Beneath this is the core structure, and this is what's important. It consists primarily of the neural whip, a tough, elastic integumentary layer analogous to, say, reinforced dermis or even a myelin sheath in terrestrial nerves. The whip is highly vascularized with blood vessels which supply oxygen and nutrition to sustain the metabolically demanding neural tissues within. At the microscopic level, the thew is composed of bundled neural fibers. These include elongated axons and dendrites extending far beyond the cranial cavity. These fibers terminate in clusters of thin pinkish worm-like tendrils, approximately 10 to 20 in number, varying by species at the distal end. In a manner of speaking, we could almost compare this to, say, cranial nerves, except rather than being still inside the body, these obviously go outside the main body, and certainly far beyond what most cranial nerves do. Each tendril is covered in a semi-permeable membrane that allows for rapid ion exchange and synaptic-like connections. Histologically, these tendrils likely contained specialized neuroglia, the support cells, that maintain ionic gradients, preserve desiccation, more accurately prevent desiccation, and facilitate regeneration if damaged in cross-section. The thew might resemble a peripheral nerve bundle with fascicles of myelinated axons surrounded by endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium equivalents for structural integrity. Most Pandoran fauna would possess one or two thews, and these are often located at the head or neck for accessibility during bonding. There's certainly one word for it. The Navi and Promurus, a primate-like species, are unique in having only one. This may represent an evolutionary adaptation for more complex social interactions. In flora, like the Tree of Souls or the Tarsu plants, thew-like structures manifest as bioluminescent rootlets or vines, integrated into Pandora's global neural network mediated by Awa, the weird godlike figure for Pandora. The physiological function and mechanisms, along with the physiology, are where things get to be a little bit funky. The thew acts as a bidirectional neural interface, extending the central nervous system externally. This enables symbiosis and communication. In effect, it's very much like having, say, a weird, almost like, say, a twin sensation, where twins, if you do something to one, will claim the other can perceive it, except this is obviously communicated deliberately and directly and is actually provable in, well, science fiction, but in the universe real. It's innervated by both sensory and motor neurons, which allows transmission of action potentials, the electrical impulse that neurons use to communicate, and neurochemical signals across organisms. The thew's neural tissues are hypersensitive with a high density of mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors. They are there to detect compatible interfaces and initiate the bonding. The primary function is the cellular navi for bond or the bond, the process of interlocking tendrils to form a temporary neural synapse. When two thews connect, the tendrils entwine and align, creating gap junctions specialized into cellular channels that allow for direct cytoplasmic continuity and rapid diffusion of ions, the usual neurotransmitters that are used, or ions needed for neurotransmitters to work, and then small molecules like cyclic AMP or neurotransmitters. This establishes what is effectively a shared neural circuit, synchronizing brainwave patterns, alpha, beta, or theta waves, and enabling real-time exchange of sensory data, memories, emotions, and motor commands. If we extrapolate out from this scientifically, it could involve bioelectric fields similar to those in, say, Earth's electric fish. Electric eels do this in a manner of speaking, where voltage-gated ion channels generate and detect signals, or like the distributed nervous system in cephalopods, where arms have semi-autonomous neural processing. Energetically, the cellular facilitates the transfer of energetic and kinetic signals, potentially therefore had to involve ATP-mediated energy sharing, or possibly using piezoelectric effects from Pandora's mineral-rich environments. Unobuntium's superconducting properties influencing bioelectricity in that case, the very reason that the humans are there to begin with. In practical terms, things are a little more challenging because we need to look at the fauna. A Navi can bond with creatures like the dire horses or mountain banshees, and by doing so override their autonomic functions to coordinate the movements. Theoretically, this is also something that verges very much on sexual assault of a beast, but we're assuming that YouTube frowns upon discussing bestiality in great detail, so we'll skip over that. This does create a rider-beast symbiosis, where the Navi perceives the animal's sensory input, enhanced olfaction, echolocation, those sorts of things, while also being able to issue motor directives. The first bond, for example during the ichneumorite, is permanent and imprints neural pathways akin to long-term potentiation in synapses. With flora, or plants, connecting to structures like the Tree of Souls accesses Awa's network. This is, for all intents and purposes, a vast mycelial web analogous to Earth's mycorrhizal fungi. It allows for the uploading and downloading of consciousness or ancestral memories. This might involve, and we're certainly getting off the deep end with this, a quantum-like entanglement of neural states, though purely speculative. With other Na'vi, it's used for mating. Yes, understand, the thing they use for sex is the same thing they use to decide whether they ride something or if they communicate with plants. The amplification of sensory feedback loops, heightening of arousal through shared endorphin and oxytocin surges, and similar, basically it becomes a sort of reproductive act, but not a genital reproductive act. It can also share memories of torture via induced neural overload, so pain and pleasure in one place. We feel like there's a particular demographic that would find that development incredibly appealing. The cue's physiology includes regenerative capabilities with stem-like cells in the neural whip promoting axon regrowth, though severe damage will impair this. It does need protective mechanisms, and we need to look at some of the pathophysiology, particularly in terms of damage. Evolutionary, the cue is vulnerable due to its external exposure, and so it needs protection. Mechanical protection is developed or facilitated through the neural whip's tough, flexible skin. That resists puncture, while the Na'vi braid adds some sort of tensile strength, possibly up to several times body weight in terms of its ability to resist forces, and sensory hairs for threat detection. Neurologically, it has to have pain receptors and nociceptors in the tendrils. These would trigger reflexive withdrawal, and the connection process includes a handshake protocol to prevent incompatible linkages. And then we have the cultural and behavioral element. Na'vi rituals emphasize cue care, viewing it as sacred. Damage to the cue as a result is catastrophic. Severing it equates to neurological castration and disrupts central nervous system integrity and causes massive neurogenic shock, hypertension, bradycardia, and loss of autonomic control due to severed afferent pathways. Victims of this experience excruciating pain from exposed nerves, and potential paralysis if the motor tracts are affected, and if not, a permanent disconnection from AWA, fauna, and social bonds. In the law, this leaves the spirit incomplete in the afterlife, akin to phantom limb syndrome amplified to existential and spiritual levels. Experimental removal in the animals, as mentioned, results in feral behavior from lost symbiotic regulation. Hypothetically, this mirrors real-world spinal cord injuries where transection can lead to loss of sensation and function below the injury site. But in this case, it is a direct brain extension. This means the cue represents what you'd almost call the pinnacle of fictional evolutionary biology, an organ that blurs the line between individual and ecosystem, enabling somewhat profound interconnectivity, while inspired by concepts like neuroprosthesis or symbiotic nervous systems, jellyfish or fungal networks. It is, however, pushing beyond current science into speculative xenobiology, which is where we need to talk about some of the weirdness going on here. In the Avatar universe, it is an externalized extension of the nervous system, and as a result it carries inherent risks and is vulnerable to certain events. It also has an integral role in Pandoran biology. This creates the deep and profound, we feel that's incredibly pretentious to say, but symbiotic connections. The misuse, damage, or exploitation of this can also lead to severe physical, physiological, pathological, psychological, and cultural harm. Although we feel like the entire movie is that wrapped up in a nutshell, given how expensive and how ridiculous it is to make and how little impact it has. But all the risks of the cue are amplified by its hypersensitive nature, the tendrils, the raw neural tissue, and something being very akin to exposed axons without myelin sheathing in a vulnerable state. It makes it incredibly prone to environmental and intentional threats. Externally, as we've mentioned, the anatomy is fairly straightforward. It protrudes from the skull and is encased in a flexible neural whip with braided hair protection. This is meant to prevent exposure to mechanical trauma, environmental hazards, and deliberate attack. But physical vulnerabilities stem from this, because it has a role as a high-tensile yet delicate appendage, with blood-rich tissues supporting constant neural activity. Trauma from manipulation or restraint, simply grabbing or pulling on the cue, would cause immediate, excruciating pain due to the mechanoreceptor activation and axonal stretching. For example, Jake Sully screams in agony when Colonel Quaritch lifts him by his cue. This illustrates how tensile force disrupts the neural integrity, potentially causing micro tears in the neural whip and or tendrils. This would be scientifically analogous to whiplash injuries in human cervical nerves. This can lead to temporary numbness, inflammation, or hematoma formation from vascular rupture. If you sever or amputate it, This is catastrophic, and it's equated to neurological castration in the law, but the act would sever bundled axons and dendrites, triggering a cascade of physical effects, blinding pain from exposed nociceptors, or the pain receptors, something akin to a forcible spinal cord transection. Imagine having a car accident where your spine is literally broken and the spinal cord is severed, something like that. The victims may therefore experience hemorrhage, shock from blood loss, muscle spasms, unconsciousness, and in the Manguan clan from Avatar Fire and Ash, acute severance causes immediate collapse, probably from neurogenic shock, sudden blood pressure drop due to autonomic disruption. Unlike with current medicine, which proposes that we can fix this in humans, regeneration of the Q is limited. While there are stem cell-like structures most likely to promote partial regrowth, full functionality is rarely restored. You would leave behind scar tissue that would impair signal transmission. And of course we need to talk about environmental hazards. The simple reality is that Pandora has a harsh ecosystem, thorns, predators, and toxic flora. This inherently presents a risk of laceration or infection. Sure, the braided hair sheath provides some protection, but breaches would introduce pathogens, and this would lead to something like cellulitis, or very similar. This would then be a form of inflammation or sepsis in the vascularized core, and then you would also have the effect of overload from forced bonding. During Sahelu, mismatched or coercive connections can, cause physical neural burnout. This can happen with the Mengwa clan torturing captives via Q linking, so we can see that this does happen. This manifests as seizures from ion channel dysregulation, excessive calcium influx overwhelming the neurons. You have hypothermia from metabolic stress, and in some cases you even have cardiac arrhythmias if autonomic signals propagate unchecked. These are the, let's say, theoretically avoidable issues, but you have to look at the physiological risks. What, in the case of Pandora, drove evolution to select this, and physiologically, the Q integrates with the central nervous system, a very dangerous choice. It extends from the brain region involved in sensory motor integration and consciousness. Disrupting this would affect homeostasis, biological signaling, and symbiotic interactions, and it would have a cascading systemic effect. A loss of neural interfacing, severance, for example, permanently disables the interaction between individuals, and it isolates the individual from AWA's planetary network. It prevents fauna bonding and interpersonal connections. It's like severing the corpus callosum in humans, but much worse. You have the complete loss of shared sensory input, and it leads to a sort of proprioceptive deficit, impaired body awareness, and reduced adaptive responses to our environment, which is like Australia, but not as bad. Then you have the autonomic and motor dysfunction. Damage can cause paralysis below the injury site, akin to tetraplegia in spinal injuries due to interrupted efferent pathways. Some can survive this, and this is almost entirely down to the fact they are resilient. The resilient survivors face chronic issues like bradycardia, a slow heart rate, hypertension, low blood pressure, or incontinence from autonomic nervous system failure. In animals, Q removal leads to an induced feral state, erratic physiology, heightened aggression from dysregulated fight-or-flight responses, and metabolic imbalances without the regulatory signals from AWA. We also have to look at the idea of bioelectric overload, a very simple way to curtail the population. During bonding, unchecked signal amplification, such as in torture scenarios, risks excitotoxicity, neuronal death from glutamate floods similar to epileptic seizures or stroke. Theoretically, using a field that emits something like this could prevent the Na'vi from getting anywhere near such a system, thereby creating what is effectively a wall out of energy. Hypothetically, doing something like this could disrupt the ion gradient, preventing sodium-potassium pumps. That would lead to edema, swelling in neural tissues, and in the long term synaptic plasticity changes. That would then impair memory, recall, and everything else, eventually killing the individuals. Similar to, say, how Parkinson's disease works, in a very rough sense. It is, however, a major and very important thing in reproduction and bonding. Let's call it that for now. YouTube frowns upon other words, and doing so means there are complications. In mating, Q bonding heightens endorphin and oxytocin surges for arousal, but forced or incompatible links can cause physiological rejection, such as anaphylaxis-like reactions or even hormonal imbalances. It means that reproduction has a very big risk to it. And Grace Augustine's quip about playing with your Q causing blindness may hint at overuse leading to either sensory overload or retinal strain from intensified visual feedback loops. We're trying to avoid being struck for community guideline issues, or possibly be a play on the adolescent reference to being overly horny. Yes, that's probably a good way to word it. Pathologically, there are certain risks, and we don't mean pathologically as in the game or as in some sort of psychological thing. We mean actual pathologies. The Q issues manifest as chronic conditions or acute crises, often irreversible due to the appendage's specialized neural cells. Neurological degeneration post-damage, and this means that over time survivors may develop phantom sensations like human amputees, but amplified. You also have hallucinations of lost bonds or persistent pain from neuroma formation, abnormal nerve growth. In lore, this leaves the spirit incomplete in the afterlife, suggesting that there is a pathological spiritual disconnect that could exacerbate neurodegenerative processes, more so if AWA's network is meant to provide some sort of neuroprotective factor. And of course we need to talk about environmental problems, infection and inflammatory diseases. Open wounds from damage would invite Pandora's microbes, like an open door to a buffet. This would potentially cause encephalitis or brain inflammation if pathogens ascended the neural pathways. Chronic inflammation might lead to autoimmune responses where the body begins attacking regenerating tendrils. Oncological risks, where high metabolic activity, particularly in the neural tissue, could predispose them to neoplasms or tumors from environmental mutagens like the unobtainium radiation. Although this isn't explicitly stated in law, that's certainly consistent with what humanity has observed in, Earth-like conditions, and, Earth itself. And then of course we have developmental abnormalities. In hybrids like the avatars, the base of the skull positioning might increase the risk of congenital defects and or integration failures during growth. This would then lead to chronic headaches and possibly vestibular imbalance. Then we have the psychological and cultural risks beyond biology. The Q's role in identity in society amplifies non-physical harm. A psychological trauma such as severance induces existential despair, often leading to things we can't say, and desires to self-delete, let's put it that way, with victims wishing that they weren't, and the bonds define Na'vi existence. This in turn mirrors something like, say, PTSD in humans, with flashbacks to lost sensations or social isolation. And of course we have the cultural and social stigma. Q damage is a taboo, an atrocity, severing one from any and all rights that really go along, and the community. In the clans like the Manquan, it's weaponized for psychological warfare, eroding trust in symbiotic bonds, and it's misused for control, for example attempts to force dominate via Qs, and is theoretically punished by AWA, although we would argue that AWA is using this exact system, potentially causing instant death or neuronal shutdown to maintain ecological balance. This enforces ethical uses, but it does risk backlash in experimental contexts. In short, the Q fosters interconnectivity, and there are significant risks underscoring it, particularly given Pandora's evolutionary trade-offs, vulnerability from symbiosis, and to an extent behaviors adapted to protect it, such as braiding. In the context of Avatar as a universe, we do need to look at one more aspect that's somewhat important, and it has to do with how the Q is used, both between individuals and between species, both flora and fauna. While no canonical sources exist for interspecies zoonoses, disease transmitted from animals to humans or vice versa, STDs or similar pathogens, it seems unlikely that the planet would be without these. And the problem is that with the way the Q functions and how it is used, we would expect there to be something like this. So if we look at the expanded lore and various discussions, Pandora appears to lack any widespread illnesses or diseases altogether, possibly due to the influences of AWA, the planetary neural network, but we're calling bullshit on that and just think that it's incomplete in terms of describing the universe. What we do know exists for sure is the vaguely related entity, the velocivirus, an invasive virus-like organism of unknown origin, which is more akin to a microscopic pest or creature than a traditional pathogen, which is studied in containment, but not depicted as causing disease in Na'vi or fauna. The human-Na'vi interactions in the films and lore focus more on environmental hazards like toxic atmospheres, high CO2 and hydrogen sulfide, leading to rapid unconsciousness and eventually death, or radiation from magnetic anomalies, rather than biological contagions. But any living ecosystem like this would inherently have some sort of microbial organisms, some sort of diseases out there. It's just not realistic to think otherwise. So with that in mind, since Q bonding involves direct bidirectional neural interfacing, essentially merging the nervous systems temporarily, it's reasonable to think that there are potential risks, and we can draw on real-world biology to look at this. It would be analogous to high-risk contacts, like blood transfusions, organ transplants, and shared needles, or even intimate bodily fluid exchanges, where pathogens could easily and very much theoretically cross species barriers. If we delve into this, we need to look into zoonoses, sexually transmitted diseases, and some related concepts, mostly around mechanisms, examples, and possible applications to Pandora. Then again, to be blunt about this, most diseases we know of today are caused by pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, or prions that jump from animals to humans, or occasionally vice versa. And these account for about 60% of human infectious diseases and about 75% of emerging diseases. And it's important to note that most of the time they occur in emerging regions with close human-animal contact, like farms, wildlife markets, or ecosystems with biodiversity as a hotspot. So we have the transmission pathways, which includes the very obvious, very clear direct contact, touching infected animals with their saliva, their blood, urine, feces, or tissues, including using of the Q. Indirect contact via vectors like ticks, mosquitoes, contaminated environments, or food and water, and finally inhalation or ingestion for airborne particles or consuming undercooked meat or nervous tissue. In the Pandoran context, Q bonding would easily facilitate zoonotic transmission by allowing pathogens to bypass the skin and mucosal barriers and directly access the central nervous system. This would resemble neurotropic nerve-targeting infections, where viruses like rabies travel on axons into the brain. And rabies is no one's idea of fun. Hypothetically, if AWAR didn't intervene, bonding with, say, an infected fauna, a dire horse or banshee, could transmit neuroparasites or viruses, leading to, at least the beginning, encephalitis or brain inflammation. And then from there you get neurodegeneration and or systemic spread. The end result of this is, one way only: death. Examples of zoonoses with interspecies relevance would be, say, rabies, where a viral disease from bites of infected animals, dogs, bats, raccoons, angry badgers, and occasionally cows, are the main mechanism for humanity at the moment, but what it does is invade the peripheral nervous system, ascend to the brain via axons, and cause fatal encephalitis. Once symptoms appear, agitation, hydrophobia, paralysis, it's practically 100% lethal. On Pandora, a Q bond would accelerate this, as it's a direct neural linkage, rather than a bite. Then you have prion diseases, BSE, mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, things like this, caused by misfolded proteins, the prions, in nervous tissue. It's transmitted by eating contaminated brain or spinal cord from cattle. In particular, the variant, the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, leads to rapid dementia and death. Q bonding could hypothetically spread prions directly via shared neural cytoplasm. We then have Lyme disease, a bacterial vector borne via tick bites from rodents or deer, can cause neurological symptoms like meningitis if untreated. Monkeypox, or mpox, however it's described now, is not necessarily ascertained from bonding with monkeys in an improper way, but rather it's a virus, and it comes from rodents or primates that have contact with fluids or lesions, and this can spread person to person, sexually, or through close contact. Exactly the kind of contact the Q achieves. Then we have interspecies STDs and related transmissions of STDs. STDs, STIs, there's a few words used now, but we'll stick with what's at least reasonably well recognized. These are a subset of pathologies, and certainly a subset of zoonoses when they cross species. Though a true interspecies sexual transmission is rare due to, anatomical and behavioral barriers, unless you go to Mexico. However, many human STDs do originate zoonotically, often via non-sexual means initially, then adapting to human sexual spread. And this is why animals do get STDs. Over 200 have been documented across taxa: mammals, birds, reptiles, insects, including viruses, parasites, and even transmissible cancers. This is why the cute, adorable koala is actually a sexual deviant, the vast majority of them appear to have chlamydia. And this is also why the zoonoses as STDs often evolve traits like host specificity, virulence modulation, and persistence in the genital area or nervous tissues. Key examples of zoonotic origins of humans, STDs, HIV, AIDS originated from the SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus in chimpanzees, and sooty mangabes, likely via bushmeat hunting, blood contact during the butchering process. Then you have multiple cross-species jumps leading to HIV-1 and HIV-2, which now spread human to human sexually or via blood. In animals, SIV often causes mild to no symptoms, but can be fatal in non-native hosts. Gonorrhea or Neisseria gonorrhea is believed to have jumped from cattle centuries ago, possibly via close contact or sexual zoonoses, although the latter is debated, where a shimming Welshman found a very attractive sheep, and that's how this all started. Then we have the causes it has. It causes urethritis, a pelvic inflammation disease, which, if untreated, causes fertility issues and or disseminates infection. We have the crowd favourite of syphilis, Treponema pallidum, possibly from sheep or cattle, which again tells us an idea about where this may have come from, with very ancient origins in non-venereal treponeal diseases. The conditions progress in stages: sore, rashes, and then neurosyphilis, brain damage if it's a chronic infection, which, although not necessarily fatal, can often be effectively the equivalent of fatal in the effects it has. Then you have chlamydia, which is related to, well, all sorts of things, but the koala example is fairly common, where it can cause blindness, infertility, and all sorts of other issues. And of course we have to talk about the human strains because, well, genital infections from trachoma, zoonotic via birds, respiratory, brucella species common in livestock, and transmitted sexually among animals or to humans via unpasteurized dairy or contact with fluids, and can cause undulant fever, joint pain, and can be chronic. Yay! Herpes viruses, which are widespread in animals, mostly via genital warts in dolphins and herpes in baboons. And then you have the human version, which likely evolved from primate strains, with the zoonotic B virus from macaques causing fatal encephalitis in humans via bites. In animals, STDs, like the koala chlamydia example, can have up to 50% prevalence in some populations, mostly spread during mating, causing infertility and population decline. And of course we have venereal tumours in dogs, a contagious cancer spread via mating, akin to what is tantamount to a parasitic cell line. Hypothetically, the behaviour in Avatar is highly risky, and we apply this to the queue, zoonotic diseases would jump. Bonding with any kind of fauna could prove to be practically fatal for the individual, if not many. It would lead to the transmission of neurotropic pathogens, leading to not only neural zoonoses, like prion-like agents, causing a Pandora mad banshee disease or a virus mimicking rabies, something like this that would induce aggression, paralysis, or other kinds of issues. You have STD analogues with the Navi-Q mating amplifying both the emotional sensory bonds during genital reproduction and also acting as a possible second vector for infection. If pathogens existed, and this is less an if and more a they do, but we don't know exactly how and what, this entire thing would spread STDs like infections, similar to how HIV exploits immune cells during sex, and the interspecies element would risk cross-hybrid transmission, like with hybrid viruses. In terms of outcomes, well, it's a pathology and it's spreading like crazy. Excitotoxicity from overload plus infection would cause chronic neuropathologies, autoimmune attacks on neural tissues, and even a disconnect from AWA. In order to mitigate it, well, AWA's network has to act like a giant planetary immune system, detecting and neutralizing the threats. But no, the arms race for humanity alone shows that you can't keep on top of pathogens forever. Eventually you need to do one of two things: eradicate them entirely, or if you can't eradicate, you need to be able to control. And we don't think AWA has the capacity to control and or eradicate. This does, however, bring us to the problem. Pandora's law keeps things disease-free, but that's primarily for narrative focus reasons. They want to show a harmonious world, and then parallel it to our real world, to highlight the intimate interspecies contact, which just no, because the reality is that, much like when the old world met the new world, it opened Pandora's box of diseases. So much so that, well, the New World encountered exciting diseases like smallpox, and the Old World encountered exciting diseases like syphilis. So, no. This is why the weird sex thing with the Q is not just weird, but weirder than you think, because of how it works and the fact that it is a huge vulnerability. A vulnerability that, if Pandora has evolution like Earth does, should have led to the destruction of the Na'vi and, for that matter, any other species with a Q, a drastic change in its format, or possibly a removal of it entirely in order to allow species to survive without having it. But then that would remove the issue around AWA, and that just doesn't fit with the plot armor. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.